Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Sperry Symposium. We will be pleased to hear from Shon and Arden Hopkin today. Shon Hopkin received his BA and MA degrees in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University and his PhD in Hebrew Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. He taught for the Seminaries and Institutes program for 14 years and enjoys speaking for the EFY program and is currently an assistant professor in ancient scripture at BYU. He and his wife Jennifer live with their 4 children in Orem, Utah. Arden Hopkin earned the Doctor of Music Arts and Performer Certificate from the Eastman School of Music as the culmination of his academic studies, which began at Brigham Young University. His career as a singer spans the operatic stage in musical theater, oratorio, and the concert platform. He has performed in Europe, Central and South America, and many regions in the United States. Until moving to BYU in 1990, he sang actively in the synagogues of Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, and Rochester, New York. He began his academic career at Texas Christian University, where he held positions of opera director and head of vocal studies at Texas Christian University. At Brigham Young University, he has held a number of positions. He currently teaches singing and vocal pedagogy and serves as graduate advisor in the vocal division of the School of Music, where he trains the next generation of voice teachers. He is married to the former Lorraine Rudd. Together they have 5 sons, the second of whom is Shon. They have 15 grandchildren. Also, at the end of today's lecture, we will have a closing prayer from Cameron Scott, a junior studying Ancient Near Eastern Studies. Thank you.
For this to pop on here. There we go. How's that? So we're very excited to be with you today. I was just sitting next to my dad and saying we're sort of an odd couple here presenting together. You've got a religion studies guy and a vocal pedagogy guy, and put those together. You would not expect a paper at Sperry Symposium from the 2 of us together, but we were excited to do this, and I think if you heard in the introduction that this actually works very well together. So I have a biblical studies background and love looking at the ritual character of the Old Testament and ordinances in the Old Testament and that kind of thing. And
I enjoy the music of it all. And we were just commenting over lunch today that when I was singing in the synagogue and Shon was a small boy, I would take my family with me to synagogue on Friday nights, and so they had some experience, and we just wondered if that might have had some bearing on his interest in this whole subject matter. But the music of the Hebrew tradition is very powerful in me, and so it's a great opportunity to cross-pollinate, so to speak. We do in more ways than one. He lives in Orem and I live in Orem, and we share a back fence, so our lives are really intertwined.
Yes. So in fact, you can tell when I've stayed up too late because my mom will say, hey, you need to go to bed earlier, Shon. I saw lights on all night. So anyway. So we are excited to be here. Now, in one sense, a little bit hard to compete with a presentation that's on new names and sacred names and that kind of thing. But we think, of course, we're biased. We think you made a good decision to be here. You get to actually listen to music today as part of the presentation. So it'll be a little bit different than what you're used to. So let me give you a feel for where we're going to be and the kinds of things we're going to be discussing over the next little while. We have, as Latter-day Saints, as Christians, a sort of standard view, a traditional view of the Psalms in which we look at the Psalms and say, okay, how do these point towards Christ? And that's wonderful and good, and it's at probably the most important thing that the Psalms do for us. We see, okay, how does this reflect David's life, and then how does it point forwards to Christ? Where do we see Christ in the Psalms? There's a problem with that view, and that is these Psalms needed to mean something when they were originally given. As they were compiled into the book, as they became joined together, why did they matter to the ancient Israelites? Now, the ancient Israelites did see messianic implications and messianic prophecies in the Psalms, but they certainly wouldn't have been familiar with Jesus' life in the same way that we are as we're looking backwards now. And so why were they powerful to those ancient Israelites? And I think as we begin to understand how they were used anciently, it doesn't diminish the Christocentric view of the Psalms, but instead I think it enhances our view of the Psalms and our understanding of what's going on there. So another way of going about this is to say these Psalms really reflect the general yearnings, the feelings, the longings, the religious pathos and desires of that ancient people, their sufferings and their triumphs, their desires for forgiveness, and that Christ then becomes the type of that. He becomes, or they become the type for Christ, I should say. He becomes the example par excellence of these themes and these longings. His life then exemplifies the ancient Israelite life in his suffering, in his yearnings, and in his triumph. One way that we could think about this, if you're thinking about music, just Taylor Swift. I'm guessing that there are 2 or 3 of you in here that may have heard one of her songs. The rest of us have no clue what's going on there. But a Taylor Swift love song, right? Either where she's in love or where it's love that has gone awry. I think she's got both of those styles. She'll sing very strongly about this relationship, and then I have teenagers in the house, this is why she comes to mind, they will sing along with it, and I know that my sweet teenage girl, she's got somebody very clear in her mind, right? She's got someone she's thinking about, and everyone that enjoys that song, either in a general or a specific way, it's personal for them. I think it also strengthens the song to think, oh, but Taylor Swift, she's thinking about somebody specific. And I don't know if that helps or not as we think of the Psalms in this way, right? That the Psalms, everyone, these matter to everyone. It is their experience. And then it even makes them more powerful and beautiful to realize, and Christ is at the center of these. Okay? So just maybe a little bit of a nuance on the way that we view these. Now, many scholars have said, and it's certainly our position, that the Psalms were used anciently in connection with the temple, and we'll show you how that is. So here's what we're going to be doing today. We're interested in the liturgical use of the Psalms, and what I mean by that is the ritual use. And we mean ritual in a very positive sense. Sometimes that word takes on negative connotations, but symbolic behaviors. Latter-day Saints, when we're talking about ritual behaviors, we would call them ordinances. And then those are rituals that have been prescribed by God that we do through priesthood authority. Ritual behaviors for Latter-day Saints, ordinances. So, and this is the idea that through song, the spiritual and the physical are brought effectively into communion, and separate individuals are brought into unity, and that music enhances the ritual experience, that ordinance experience, in a way that really allows the ritual to be cemented in an individual, the beliefs that are portrayed in that ritual then to become deep. And again, our lunchtime conversation, why am I drawn to these things? Is there the possibility that when I was a young child, I heard my father singing music in a Jewish synagogue, and I feel I've continued to feel some draw there, some connection there. I think that possibility is there. So really then, for a Latter-day Saint audience, I think why does this matter, besides just this historical overview of the Psalms? I think there's 2 reasons that it matters to us. First, what can we learn about our singing? I heard somebody right before we started say, I wish we sang the Psalms more. And you may feel that way even more after we're done. And when we do sing the Psalms, which actually we do in our sacrament meetings, when we do sing the Psalms, what is the full range of meanings in that can have? When we sing in church in really a ritual kind of a format, we've got a very set opening hymn, sacramental hymn, closing hymn. What does that mean? How can that deepen that worship experience that we have? And then also, I think as we talk about music, as many of you know, we don't do a whole lot of music in our temple worship today. But if we were to think of temple ordinances as a song, as music, as a way that God is connecting us physically and spiritually through our whole selves, then I think there are some insights that can come. So I would encourage you to be thinking about your temple worship as we're talking today, and then also to be thinking about your musical worship. Good? Okay, he's going to chime in anytime. But Here's where we're going to be today. So first we'll give you an overview of the kinds of psalms that exist, and then how were those psalms used in an ancient temple setting. Now this is the trickiest because we just have to interpret the best we can. And we'll make some proposals that many would agree with, some might disagree with. Then after we move out of, and we'll spend quite a bit of time there in the temple setting in the Old Testament with the Psalms. Then the second half today we'll be saying, okay, how have the Psalms been used in worship settings since then, the liturgical use of Psalms over time. And here's where you'll get the majority of your music in what we're discussing today. We'll show you examples of plain chant, responsorial, and antiphonal singing, and just some various things there. We'll finish with some LDS examples that I hope by the time we get there you'll be able to see, this is what we're doing. This is what we're trying to accomplish when we sing the Psalms in church. And we're hoping to have enough time to look at what we think are some sort of fun modern adaptations as the Psalms have been taken then outside of religious settings and have had power for people today. And honestly, there's some, you may be surprised, some of the bands that have chosen to implement the Psalms in their own music. Okay, so I'm going to keep talking at you here for a little bit and introducing then the kinds of Psalms that we have. And the goal here is, how might these Psalms be connected to temple worship? First, we've got Psalms of prayer or lament. These are times of personal or national crisis. And so you either come together to the temple as a community, or you come maybe with your family or even by yourself to worship at the temple. The kind of personal crisis that we see is Hannah when she comes and she's concerned that she has not been able to give birth to a child. National crisis, you see Saul wanting to offer sacrifice before they go out. And so you come to the temple to express your concerns before the Lord, to ask for his help, and then to express your faith that he can help you. And again, if you think about the way we come to a sacrament meeting, bringing those burdens and then placing them upon the altar there of the sacrament table, or a temple setting, bringing with those concerns, then that's helpful, I think.
I'm just going to jump in because a thought came to my mind as Shon was talking, that we do that same sort of thing when we go to the temple. We often bring concerns, and we write those concerns down, and those become part of the whole worship that later on occurs in the temple.
Yeah. Thank you. And there are prayers over those people, those issues that we have. This is one of the goals of temple worship. All right, so in these kinds of psalms, many of them exhibit, and we're going to come back to this, a three-part division. Now, those of you who have heard me talk about Old Testament worship before, you know I love this topic, right? And I think it's very helpful for us to understand better what's going on in our worship, to understand this three-part division. In the Psalms, it shows up in this way. First, a description of the trial, then a plea for help, and then an expression of faith in God's ability to deliver. So remember that, we're going to come back to that. And you've got a whole series of psalms that are psalms of prayer or lament. You've got a whole series that are psalms of praise. These kind of psalms likely sung with what would be known as the peace offering, or the thanks, the votive will offering, where you come because you're feeling grateful for a blessing, where you come with a desire to be closer to the Lord. And those sacrifices actually end in a communal meal with the priest. And so this is a very joyous kind of example. And we do these in church today, and we'll talk more about this. So those are probably used at national holy days, when the whole community gathers together, and you're celebrating God as creator and as king, and that this mirrors the anointing of kings, which always happened at temples, right? And so the king would come up to a temple to be anointed, and that would happen right there on the temple precincts, often authorizing him to become the king, and at times in other places. Psalms of thanksgiving, And you've got a whole series. So this would be like when Noah leaves the ark and he offers sacrifice. We don't know if a psalm was sung there, but that'd be the kind of circumstance. Psalms of Zion. These then encourage people to come up to Mount Zion, come up to worship in the temple, and call to worship. You might see these as similar to opening hymns in our sacrament meetings, saying, come worship together. Go ahead.
In our tradition, we have a hymn that we call Israel, Israel, God is Calling, and it serves that same purpose as Shon is describing.
What are known as liturgical psalms. Now, a lot of times these will be a dialogue, and you can see it right in the psalm. I've got an example here. There are a number of them. 15 and 24. Look at the way this dialogue works out. And many scholars believe this was the kind of thing that we would see as a temple recommend. You're coming to the temple. Are you worthy to enter the temple? And a priest would ask a question in song format. You would respond. And then there's this reminder, I must be holy to enter into the temple. You could think of the temple recommends desk that we pass by there, and there's a bit of a dialogue, right? Or at least a nod or I don't know that any of us have ever been kicked out at that point, but right, there's a yes, you can come in, right? This Psalm 15, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? The priest might say, and then the worshiper might respond, he that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness. And then many of us know this from Psalm 24, who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who's going to be able to go into the temple? Only those that have clean hands and a pure heart. So it becomes very temple connected.
And in that structure, you find the origins of responsorial music that occurs both in the temple, we're going to take a look at it today, and shows up in the musical practices of many, many religions thereafter.
So just a couple, and I'll be very brief with these. Royal psalms depicted important events in the lives of royalty, but then, of course, for Christians, we see a lot of messianic prophecy in these as they talk about Christ as the royal king. And then wisdom psalms aren't, as far as we can tell, connected to the temple unless you were to say the temple is a place of the teaching of wisdom, a place of learning. But as far as the liturgical purpose of them, they're much more, let's teach some concepts than they are maybe sung at the same time or in preparation for the sacrifices being given. So Old Testament, you actually see this happening. You see in the temple, you see people worshiping through psalm, through singing. David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant, and you know that the Ark represents the presence of God. The other name for the Ark of the Covenant is the mercy seat. The idea is this is the throne of God, and it is being brought back into Israel, and there is singing and worshiping. And the kind of singing is seek the Lord's face. So think of that in temple settings, right? That the psalm itself is encouraging you, seek the presence of the Lord. Seek to enter into the presence of the Lord. You've got priests there ministering in the presence of the Lord is the idea, before the ark of the Lord. And they're using instruments. We don't have a whole lot of trumpet playing in our temple today, but they did some of that anciently. You see it later. And by the way, we should just nuance this just a little bit. Anything you want to say there, or shall I go ahead?
Yeah, I do want to say something because both of us spent a long time in Fort Worth, Texas, and of course the Dallas Temple is there close at hand with the angel Moroni on top with him blowing the trumpet. And the Music Concert Hall in downtown Fort Worth, Texas has two angels with two trumpets held out of bas relief against the facade that were the architect borrowed from the LDS temple. And at the time of concert, the conception was that these trumpets would blare, telling everybody that it was time to come to the concert. Of course, the businesses around didn't like that much, so we don't get the trumpets blaring to say that the concert's coming, but we have that facade there that is reminiscent of what you're talking about.
So you've got Moroni there at the pinnacle of the temple blowing a trumpet. So in that sense, I guess we very much have trumpets playing every time you go to the temple, right? And he's announcing the gospel, but inviting, calling to come and worship at the temple. The other thing I was going to say here as well is some biblical scholars would say, okay, did this show up later as this second temple after they returned from Babylon, or did this really happen in first temple? The scripture scriptures show it happening in First Temple. You'd have some biblical scholars say, no, they're sort of projecting that backwards. But this is the way that the Bible tells story, and I believe very strongly that they're singing. This is what they're doing. So you've got there, as Solomon is dedicating the temple, they're dressed in all in white. They've gone through sacrifices to sanctify themselves. They're playing with harps and psalteries and that kind of thing. It's fascinating that they're going to, as they sing the psalm, the very next thing that happens, God enters into his temple. Okay, the presence of God comes in, and it was psalm singing that caused them to enter into the presence of the Lord. Now, I keep being tempted to say this. Maybe I'll go ahead and say it now. I want you to think, I don't know if you've thought of this before, but some of our psalm singing happens in connection with the sacrament. We sing a psalm. Obviously, a priestly prayer is given at the altar, at the sacrament table, and then the cloth is removed as part of that process, and we enter into the presence of God. Music gives us the power. It lifts us to another state so that we are prepared to enter into God's presence.
And we're going to show that example. One of the pieces of music of LDS hymnology that we're going to show near the end is a sacramental hymn that has this same origin.
All right, and then I'll just be really brief here. You've got, it's recorded later on in the Mishnah and Talmud, but they have later reminiscences that here's the order. You do these psalms on these days in the temple, and that it was connected to temple. All right, so let's take a little break from me blabbing at you and say, okay, how might this have sounded anciently with trumpets and with lyres and that kind of thing?
In Chronicles, it talks about how the Levitical orders were organized into choirs, and they had musicians. So these were professional, by normal standards, professional musicians that were providing the music for the worshipers who came to the temple. And here's an example of what it might have sounded like.
And we'll talk a little bit more about this here in just a moment.
You'll hear chanting, you'll hear melody, you'll hear instruments. There will be a lute that's standing in for the lyre. You'll hear cymbals and you'll hear trumpets. And while this is playing, will you pay attention to what it feels like to you when you hear this music? What emotion does it awaken in you? Because that's kind of the thesis we're talking about, that the presence of the music puts us in mind to enter into God's presence.
Oh, we can't see it. I'd like you to be able to see what's on my screen. For some reason, it keeps disappearing. Hold on just a second. And I'll start it again. Maybe. Can you see that now? No, it just keeps pulling that up. Hold on just 1 second. Let me play with something. It was doing this to us before. Sorry for the delay. Let's try that. Hopefully that'll allow and it won't switch back on me. Oh, look, it pulled it right away. Okay, I'll try one more time and then we'll just have to listen. There you go. Okay. Ta-da. Technology. You see, this is a praise psalm, joyous, and we don't know what would have been sung at that time, the kind of thing that might have been sung, the dedication of the temple. we'll talk about where that recreation came. We do not know what music in the temple sounded like. There's just no way for us to know this, and we'll explain that recreation here in a little bit. I don't know how you felt as that was playing, but the idea is that music acts as a marker to say, much like prayer does, and of course we have the concept in the Doctrine and Covenants that songs are a prayer of the heart, or a prayer of the righteous. And music acts as a marker that says you have stepped out of your regular experience and now you are entering into sacred time and sacred space. And that we leave other things behind, we separate from them, and now we're in the music. And you notice how this is used in secular senses in music today. I don't know, how many of you really love your music? I mean, you're really big into music. Anybody? And you put that music on and it takes you to a different place. And this is the idea. It prepares you then to enter into the presence of God. Now, I'm showing this in preparation for explaining something that's sort of fun, our reconstruction. But what you see there, what we've got circled there are cantillation marks. These, we don't have them officially. I mean, our earliest Hebrew text is 10th century AD. We assume these are much older than that. We don't know how old they are or when they began to show up and be written that way. These would allow, and still allow today, Jewish cantors to read or to sing in an appropriate way. And I had just a little bit of training, not enough to do this well, from a Jewish rabbi. I said, okay, now this marking means you hold it out here. Now you elevate a little bit here. Now there's a pause. Okay, now hold that phrase out. And we're going to give you an example of that.
And while Shon's playing this, this is a tradition that would be recognized by Jewish communities all over the world, even though they have somewhat different traditions, execution on this thing. However, it's always a guess. It's always an assumption that this is the way that it was to be done. And this is an example that you'll hear of a rabbi reciting a text with these, following these cantillation markings.
This is straightforward reading, but you'll hear how he holds things out. He lifts and then lowers as he's reading, and what he's doing is following those markings. This is Psalm 24.
לדוד מזמור, לאדוני האורץ ומלואו, תבל ויושביבו. כי הוא על ימים יסודו, ועל נהרויס יכוננהו. מי יעלה בהר אדוני, ומי יקום במקום קודשוי? נקי כפיים ובר לבוב, אשר לא ינוסו לשוב נפשי, ולא נשבע למרמו. יסוד רוחו מעץ אדוני, וצדקו מאלוהי ישעוי. זה דור דורשוב, מבקשי פונךו יעקב סלו.
So in the original Hebrew text, there's no punctuation. There's no sense of where the sentence begins or where it ends. But these cantillation markings have been used by people who've read the text, as you just heard, as a decoding that exists. And this, all of the Masoretic texts will have these cantillation markings beneath the text, and in some cases superimposed above the text.
Yeah, you can see them above here and below. Those are not the vowel markings. The others that aren't circled are vowel markings and other reading tools, but this is about. And now, keep those in mind as we discuss this next concept here.
So back in about 1950, there was a French musicologist named Suzanne Haïk-Ventura who was an organist in the synagogue, and she was curious about those markings and started to puzzle about them and think about them. And she started from an assumption that those markings were not used as were traditionally the case, but actually were representations of the 8 steps in the Western diatonic scale. And over the years, she worked this out, not only in the poetic texts, which have some certain kinds of markings, but throughout the whole of the Bible. These markings exist in all of the books of the Bible, but are particularly and uniquely fashioned in the 3 poetic books. So what NPR did a presentation on her, and we've taken an excerpt out of that presentation from NPR that will give you a sense of both what the music or what the text would sound like in its traditional cantillation and what that same text would sound like decoded the way that she did it. Incidentally, that music that we played for you at the very beginning, that's a manifestation of her interpretation of these cantillation markings. So listen as you hear these two juxtaposed.
It's actually really fun because this is very early to have musical notations. And other biblical scholars would say, no, you can't have musical notations that early. This is they just didn't do it that early, but it works. I mean, so she does it this way and it works. No way to know whether this is the way it was or not, but it is fascinating what she's been able to propose, saying, nope, this is telling you where the notes are supposed to be.
Fantastic.
The Jews have always sung the Bible, but each community has its own way, based on an oral tradition handed down over generations. I asked Dr. Dufshani to sing for me, first the way he was taught in his community, then according to the music of the Bible revealed by Ike von Tura.
הצבי ישראל, על במותיך חלל, איך נפלו גיבורים, אל תגידו וגת, אל תבשרו בחוצות אשקלון.
So this would be a traditional singing from his community. Sort of developed over time.
This is how I would sing it in my community if they wanted me to sing those verses. Now, what happens with the music of Ike von Tura? You want to listen to it? Yeah. הצבי ישראל, על במותיך חלל, איך נפלו גיבורים. אל תגידו בגת, אל תבשרו בחוצות אשקלון, פן תשמחנה בנות פלישתים.
Good. All right. So you can see that actually works. The music encoded there in the Bible, there's that possibility anyway that we thought.
I just
was
have
really
to jump
fun.
in and say that that cantillation pattern was one with which I was very familiar because the rabbi would use that pattern in his readings of the Torah and the Mishtorah, the Haftorah. And in my case, many of the modalities that are represented by the music that you just heard are modes that I was familiar singing in the church, in the synagogue.
Good. So just a few last things, and I'll try to be brief here because we want to move now beyond the biblical era. But first, let me just say this, and I think this may be helpful for some of you as far as you think about the connection with temple worship and with church worship. We talked before about a threefold division of some psalms: lament, a plea section, and then an ending section that's very triumphant. God will bless me. So you come, I've got this difficult thing in my life, and then you say, there's a section that says, please help me with this. God will help me. God will save me, expressing that kind of faith. Interestingly enough, you find in those that do ritual theory and look at different kind of religious rituals around the world, this threefold division shows up over and over and over again. And just compare those two: a separation stage where you say, okay, I've got to leave behind the challenges and the attractions of the mortal world. And now you go through a liminal stage, and limen is a doorstep, it's a threshold. So you're crossing from one state of being into another, and then an aggregation stage where you're brought into a new, holier relationship. And you can see these, for example, in the sacrament, right? We come and we mourn for our sins, and we say, I'm going to leave those behind. And then in the sacrament prayer, we plead for unity and for blessings. And then the triumphant aggregation stage, we step into the presence of God there in the sacrament. We become one with God as a community. Baptism. Sometimes the separation stage is hard for outsiders who don't understand it. Baptism, you die, right? And then there's this traveling into a new community through baptism, and then of course the Holy Ghost, the gift of the Holy Ghost is a fulfillment of that. You could think of temple ordinances as well, and that we separate ourselves from a worldly setting. Many of you know that men and women will sit on different sides of the room, and that others would say, well, why? Well, you're separating. Even your positive associations have worldliness mixed with them. So you separate, you pass through a liminal stage where you make new covenants, and then you come back together in new, holier relationships with God involved in that relationship. That's sort of what's going on there, and we see it reflected in the Psalms. Now, others have not connected ritual theory with that threefold division in the Psalms before, so this is something that we're proposing. And we believe that this connects with what you see in Old Testament sacrifices. So you kill an animal, what stage is that, obviously? That's your separation stage, right? And then there's the sprinkling of the blood, this let God's power enter into our lives. And then finally, often there will be the eating of the meal together with the priests, the sacred meal that's much like our sacrament. Other times, the burnt offering, the smoke goes up, it's a sweet savor to the Lord, and you are connected with the Lord. Day of Atonement, right? There's sacrifice, and then the high priest passes through the stages of the temple, stands before the veil, and then enters into God's presence. And so you see in the ordinances, you see this threefold division, and the Psalms, it would have, we do not know how these sounded, right? But it would have worked very well for some dissonance during that stage, and it heightens emotionally. Could have come either before or during. And then sort of a minor mode in this pleading that then leads into this triumphant conclusion, and it reflects emotionally what God is trying to accomplish, what we are trying to accomplish through our temple worship. And again, I want you to think of your modern temple worship. I'd encourage you to think of it in terms of a song being sung, of music being expressed there in your temple worship.
I'll just chime in also that as you think about the partaking of the sacrament, and you think about the veil of the temple, and you think also about that covering that's over the emblems of the Lord's Supper, we usually think of it as something else, just a cover over to keep the flies off the bread and the water. But it can also be symbolic of a veil that's lifted to allow us into the presence of God, and as we receive the sacrament and take it into ourselves, we actually find union with God. So there's ritual readily available to us in that thing that we do every week.
So we compare that to the veil of Solomon's temple is what he's referring to there, the high priest enters into God's presence, right? There's a song we sing, and we do this every week. We sing, there's a priestly prayer, and then that veil is removed from off of the sacrament, and we step into God's presence. This has temple connotations that are very much connected to Solomon's temple anciently, right? Christ, this is from Psalm 22, an example of this sort of famous, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is a psalm that has these elements, and this is the separation stage. Christ is the sacrifice that's being separated, and then there's this plea there in the psalm, and then a triumphant conclusion. I believe that when Christ says that phrase, he's also pointing to his followers, this is going to work out. They would have that's the opening line, sort of like come, come ye saints for us. And they would have recognized, he's saying this is going to turn out in the end, or at least they would have tried to recognize that. You see this in the Book of Mormon and Nephi's psalm, this sort of famous psalm. Oh, woe is me for the weakness of the flesh. Please help me to overcome it, and then I know in whom I have trusted, and God will help me, right? So you see this over and over again. All right, post-biblical. Here we go. I'm looking at the clock. Go ahead.
We don't know too much about what happens to the synagogue after the destruction of Jerusalem. Certainly, the Jews continued to worship, but their traditions were oral. What we do have that we can trace are the Christian traditions that came into ascendancy and had their origins in the synagogue. You'll remember that those who first participated in Christianity were first Jews and followed many of the same practices that were found in the synagogue, among which are these cantillations. And then as it moves down through the ages, it found its way into the Orthodox religions of Christianity. We have a couple of examples we'd like to play quickly for you. Both of them from the Greek Orthodox tradition. The first one representing the plain chant that you would hear. And again, I'd ask you to listen to what it feels like to be on the listening end of this participation. These are monks, so if we were to go into that, we would hear the monks singing, we wouldn't sing with them, because the level of precision required to do this in unison is hard. you'll hear two things. You'll hear the plain chant. You'll also hear a kind of a drone underneath that represents a kind of harmonious organum.
Have any of you ever seen or used a cycle of psalms reading where you read a psalm every day? Any of you ever seen those? This still exists in our usage, in Christian usage today, and it's a ritual. I'm going to begin the day trying to enter into God's presence, right? Okay, so let's look at how this developed over time.
There's much more to that, but you can also hear the sophistication of the chant, the little intonations, the little inflections that are given to the text that grow out of, we believe, the traditional cantillations that were used in the synagogue. The next one is an example of a responsorial, where you'll have a priest who first recites the Alleluia, followed by the choir of priests or representing the congregation. And that was the tradition that continued on for about, well, we don't really know for sure how long, but at least from about 800 onward, up until the period of the Reformation. And some significant things happened to the Psalms at the point of the advent of Protestantism, one of which was that we no longer had a priest who recited, because there wasn't really anybody that had the full authority of the priesthood as implied by the Catholic faith. And so what you end up with is a musical style that is more democratic, that is hymn singing. So we've got a couple of examples to play for you, both of which come from Westminster Abbey. So we're looking at the Church of England, which is an interesting hybrid cross between High Liturgy, as adopted from the Roman tradition, and the Protestant tradition, which was that everybody participates. So you get something where the choir is reciting together, the congregants are listening. The recitation's a little complicated, so not everybody could join in, but the interesting thing is now all of a sudden, at important cadential points, they break into harmony, and it's different than the others.
So let me just say this before we play that. The idea with, prior to the creation of meter and of rhyme, you have an emphasis on the text. You cannot alter the text. And that connected to music then reverberates in the body, and then you're separated and placed in sacred time. We're going to see that shift, right, when we get to Protestant. This is a Catholic view. Every word in worship uttered out loud, and some words in our services are to be kept silent, not because they're secret, but because they're too holy for mortals in ordinary circumstances to utter out loud. In other words, they're saying some things are so sacred that you don't want everybody to hear it. Everything is sung because it's holy. It's sacred. We even sing the scriptures in sacred tones that I suspect have temple roots. He's saying, oh, we've used the temple in our worship services. If the sanctuary of a Catholic church building is meant to represent the vision, it is also meant, of the Holy of Holies, it's also meant to render it audible. So this is what was just referring to, this unmetered still, focusing on the text, but now an increasing level of sophistication in the harmonies.
So while that's happening, I just got the signal that we're out of time. So we're going to play a little bit of this, and then we're going to just cut to the chase. Okay, so that gives you that sense. We're going to skip the responsorial in the interest of time and just say that as time moved along, one of the evidences that we turn to is the Bass Psalter book that was published in the 17th century in Boston. And we have a very brief musical excerpt, which we won't play for you, of a soloist who is singing accompanied by a lute and a piano and so forth. In that tradition, it would have simply been the congregation singing. And now they were singing metered and rhymed, so no longer was it the true integrity of the text, but the essence of the text and musical value started to rise. So we're going to jump forward very quickly to LDS usage, and you're going to hear a metered, rhymed version of the 23rd Psalm, which we sing on a regular basis in our services.
This is the 23rd Psalm, but you see we've shifted the words. In Protestant usage, it's the message that's central. The words are maybe slightly less important, but and then what you can do with music in now a whole congregation who may not be trained singers is when you've got rhyme and meter.
So you can hear that the meaning of the text is still, the essence of the text is there, but it's changed. And that's something that we've adopted from a Protestant tradition. I bet you don't realize it, but we have in our hymn book a responsorial hymn, a hymn that is first sung by a priest, supposedly in the tradition, a question that's asked, and then a response of the congregation. We'd like to play that for you.
Was witnessed in the heavens by an angel earthward bound.
That's why we do that awkward thing, right? That's where this comes from.
Okay, it actually comes from a very ancient tradition. We also have in our hymn book one example of antiphonal singing, where the men and the women separate themselves and then come to unity later on. You're going to be so sad to know that after we conclude this, we have to stop, and you're going to miss some of the really exciting stuff we were going to show you. This is an example of antiphonal singing, where half of the congregation separates itself and then the others respond. That tradition of antiphonal singing started, supposedly, with Miriam and Moses as they came out of the Red Sea. So we had some other examples. We're not going to play them for you, but if we finish and you want to hear, how would you like to hear Megadeth singing the 23rd Psalm? Or we've got a reggae version of the 23rd Psalm.
All right. Those that need to go, of course, feel free to do so. Let me just say before we do that, that metered really, so there's rhythm now. And what we're saying is we're imitating the order of heaven, right? It's lifting us up. In dynamics now, you can have this building and then this increasing focus on the music. And this is what sometimes we feel like is missing in our LDS services, our understanding that ritually we are entering into the presence of God, signifying we're leaving sacred space and time. I probably should have said this after Megadeth. Here's Peter Tosh.
This is
this valley, I will be.
Recognize Psalm 23 there?
Okay, so just as you prepare yourselves for Megadeth, I want you to think what it would sound like to hear the 23rd Psalm recited in Klingon. You laugh, but I actually was curious about that, so I looked on the internet and I found, not the 23rd Psalm, but I found the play, Shakespeare's play Hamlet, translated and performed in Klingon. And you'd say, well, that sounds sacrilegious, but in actual fact, it sounded pretty cool. I'm not endorsing what we're about to hear.
The idea, though, is this is, as the Bible now, we've got an increasingly secular society. Is it good or is it bad that these themes are adapted into different applicable contexts? And you'll have to decide that. You're not going to enjoy this very much. I would suspect maybe we've got some Megadeth fans. I turned the volume down, by the way. Oh, not that far down, though. Oh, you'll be shocked. Now, by the way, they claim they're not being sacrilegious here. This is the way that they express themselves. Is that enough?
Listening to the bells, listen to the tolling of the bells as would happen in a death march. Listen to the incessancy of the rhythm that will not relent. And surrounded in all of those things are these words that say, despite all of this chaos that's going around me, I will trust in God. So the metaphor is just different than what we're used to, but certainly can find meaning.
Now, I hesitate to let that be the last thing that you hear today, but I know we're over.
I don't think I will.
I've been working on him for a while, and I think we're going to finish.
So at any rate, we're gonna take a look at the Hebrew slaves hymn from Verdi's opera Nabucco, and this is a recreation or a modification of Psalm 37. And in this setting, this is secular, but it's reminiscent of something religious. And we're going to just play about a minute of this for you to hear. This is 19th century. This is grand and holy, and in some respects serves the same purpose that the psalm did in the temple worship. Even though they're in exile and the temple was not available to them, their longing would translate into this sound.
You've got lament, you've got plea, and you've got triumph reflected, that threefold stage here. The nice, powerful. Okay, we'll finish there.
We'll stop at that point. But I'll just put my final 2 cents in to say that this has been a really wonderful study because it's about the only time I can get my son alone to share in an activity together because he's a really busy man. But it's also an opportunity to kind of bring full circle some things that have been important to me through my creative life as a singer, and to do a little bit of in-depth study on a subject that's been intuitively important in my life.
And I would just say, as we return to our worship settings in sacrament meeting, I hope that understanding of the purpose of the Psalms to signify sacred time and space, we are separating from the world, preparing to enter into the presence of God through the sacrament. And then, of course, we've got a joyful at the beginning of sacrament meeting, a triumphant at the end, to sort of say we're thankful to be here. Will have more significance for us. Most importantly, I hope we can view in our temple worship the beautiful song that the Lord is encouraging us to sing in our relationship with Him. And we'll close in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.